documentary has expanded so much.
Exactly.
I think the kind of work that I've been doing recently wouldn't have been called documentary 15 years ago, and now it fits within the umbrella of documentary.
No, it's exactly the same, I think. I still do trips on my credit card. I get some commissions and balance the two out.
The stories that people can tell to put with your visuals, I think are, can be a fantastic addition.
I no longer see a distinction really between going out and taking pictures of the world and going out and taking pictures from the world.
It's 25 years since Panos Pictures was founded as the commercial arm of the Panos Institute, an environment and development NGO. And it's that relationship that we have with the Panos Institute that has coloured what we've done over the last 25 years. The issues we choose to cover, our approach, the way we work. We sit between the not-for-profit world and the for-profit world, and it's that space that we occupy that makes us unique.
Where we were was much more working in a sort of single image environment, in a press environment. And this is a one-off.
The wall came down on 9th of November. And I remember that there were lots of photographers in London trying to get to Berlin at that time. And the flights were getting incredibly booked up, and then the price just escalated because all the staff photographers and the press agencies were throwing money over the counters to get their photographers out there. So I realised I wasn't going to make it. So I thought, I'll go at New Year. As I was walking down, approaching the Brandenburg Gate, you could see these letters SAR and SAR through some of the spaces in the columns. I thought, what? That can't be Saatchi and Saatchi. Is it possible, It didn't appeal to me at all to be in a scrum of news photographers. I did it a few times, I hated it. What always appealed to me was being out on my own. And this kind of thing I got because I was not around other photographers. Very much somebody who likes to be out there documenting. I'm interested in history. So.
Well, this is a piece of history.
That's it, it's a historic photo. I think that's what I feel about it. It is a piece of history, and I was very lucky to get it.
I can sort of hear the banter. It wasn't aggressive, but it was slightly jeering. This picture was taken in 1986, before the 87 general election. It was against a background of recession, post-miners' strike, post the big shake-up of the media with Murdoch at Wapping. When I look at that picture now, there's something wonderfully naive about it, in that is a Prime Minister in a controlled walkabout that was basically hijacked by real life. I couldn't take it today. For a still photographer to be able to stand back and get a clean picture of real people with a leading politician in a real world situation is practically impossible because of the pressures on A, the spin doctors, but B, the rolling 24-hour news. To actually see a politician that hasn't got 14 fluffy microphone boons under their noses is quite a rare thing.
Martin Adler was a Panos photographer who was tragically murdered in Somalia in 2006 by Islamic radicals. He once said, I want to go to the place where nobody else goes to, and I want to listen to the people that nobody else listens to. And that just about summed him up. And in that respect, he was very much a Panos photographer. When we began to work with him in the early 90s, he was one of the very few Panos photographers that did cover conflict. And as a result, was very, very important to us. There were many major events in the 90s, Chechnya, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Liberia, endless events that he was the only Panos photographer at, which made him very key to our development as an agency. A large number of his photographs from the conflict areas deal with the effect of conflict on civilian populations, and I can think of a number of pictures that really illustrate that very strongly. One he took in Liberia. He told me afterwards that he'd been in a building which was a firing point on the forward line in Monrovia, and he was coming down through the building photographing as he went, and he just came round a corner and there was a Liberian government fighter standing there just holding a baby. There's something very surreal about it. There's a weightlessness about it. There's a stillness as well. He's able to separate the action and just capture this moment, and in a way you don't know that there's a war raging outside the window. Another picture from Abkhazia where a woman is leaning against a wall. I'm not sure what she's doing. She might just be waiting for a bus, and next to her is a sleeping soldier, but they're totally unconnected, although they are within half a metre of each other. It's almost as if neither of them is aware of the other's presence. Unusually, Martin was shooting stills and video from very early on in his career, from the early 90s up until when he died. Nowadays that's fairly standard practice, but when he started, very, very few people did that, and he was able to deliver both to an exceptionally high standard. When he was in Liberia, he was working for Channel 4 making a feature whilst at the same time shooting stills for Aftonbladet, a Swedish newspaper. And in fact, during the time he was in Monrovia, which was under siege, he did the nightly reports back to London for Channel 4 News because they couldn't get anyone into the city. So he was kind of keeping several balls in the air at the same time.
Not only were there far less photographers in those days, but there were very few women photographers. So on the one hand, yeah, you have maybe one or two, the usual kind of battles as a woman, but it was also an advantage, really, and particularly in Kosovo, it was an advantage because I was working on my own and I could be in the back of the car going through police roadblocks, all this kind of stuff, and not really be noticed.
I think it's always an advantage being a woman, but, well, actually that hasn't been true all of my life, but I think it's got easier and easier. And definitely working as a photographer, I don't find it a disadvantage for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes because you're not taken so seriously, you're not so confrontational, you can often get behind the scenes easier. I think also you don't feel the pressure that you have to get the bang bang story, that you can go for the more background feature. There's one of a woman called Razia who's holding her wedding picture, and it was 1996 and it was really cold time in Kabul. Everyone was fearing that the Taliban were about to arrive, which was what happened a few months later. And Razia is one of the few people in the book who I've kept in regular contact with, and every time I meet her, and she's now older and older, I'm sort of aware of the passage of time and also the gulf between her and that picture taken when she wore her hair free, when she'd just got married. Her husband had since disappeared, presumed killed. When I first started photographing, I think in the early 80s, women weren't on the news agenda so much. Now, I think if reporters are covering a conflict, they will go for the women and children's story as well as the bang bang, the frontline stuff. I think that women have pushed to have women featured alongside the rest of the story.
Actually, going back 20 years, 25 years, there was less, certainly, construction of images within the broad area of photojournalism.
Was it a bit one-dimensional? And now you can't, that's not good enough?
With the benefit of hindsight, it's one-dimensional. We didn't think at the time, oh my God, this is one-dimensional. It's what we knew and what we did. But now we realise that there are so many more dimensions that you can work within in documentary and photojournalism.
And you have to be a bit more considered and conceptual, maybe.
Well, I think so, because so many things have been done before. Just because something's been done before is not an argument for not doing it again. But I think if you are going to do it again, you have a duty to try and do it differently.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that is looking at Tim Hetherington's Liberia and the graffiti in Liberia. Now, you know, we know that Tim did do some kind of more classic storytelling type photographs. But this edit, which he's very into himself, is the graffiti. And not only is that interesting because it is this whole idea of aftermath kind of photography, but without having the people in, but you have this very personal, because it is essentially handwriting or scarring of the walls. I mean, does that tell you more? I mean, that's, I guess the question is, how does that work when people...
Well, it does tell me more, because I have to use my imagination.
Yeah.
It's not like bang, bang, here's a dead body, here's something that's been blown up. I can kind of, I've seen all that before in a way, and I kind of know, okay, you just transfer, you know, it transfers from one geographical position to another, but conflict is essentially conflict. But it's what happens, it isn't just that moment, it's about what are the ramifications of that thing that you're seeing, because there are ramifications way beyond what's in the frame.
Yeah.
And also the ramifications of what happens after a war has finished are as important and more important and much more long-lasting, obviously, than the events during a conflict itself.
Yeah.
As you've got more and more of the photographer in their own work, that also is reflected in the way that photojournalism has moved somewhat away from the editorial market, or is less dependent on the editorial market now. And of course, within the editorial market, you have very little control over what you produce.
If you were to ask how I define myself now, I would simply say a photographer. But if I look at how my income is generated, I'm more an artist than a photojournalist. I mean, I get my money, apart from grants, it is more from print sales and exhibition fees than from publications. And I think the last time I had an assignment from a magazine must have been about 5 years ago. There are two main lines. If you look at my work of the last 10 years or so, and one is a worldwide comparison of elements that are vital in society, yet that very few people would photograph because they don't seem to be very photogenic. US was a disaster because nobody could tell me where to get a permission, and nobody was even answering. Like, you would send an email and you wouldn't hear anything, send another email, no reply. At some point you find the person's phone number, so you call him. All right, shall I just briefly tell you what was in the email? Yeah, wonderful. Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. So you start explaining, and the guy says, well, you know what, send me an email. If you would drop all the other reasons why it's interesting to look at bureaucracy, it's also a very interesting way to portray a country.
The approach we take at Panos